Your little passion project isn't a career. It's a hobby I'm paying for. You know, it wasn't always like that. I still remember the years before the steakhouse and the laughter. My life felt busy, cheap coffee and late buses, but mine. I was 26 and running on stubborn hope. During the day, I worked as a junior designer, the kind who gets handed the boring layouts and asked to make it pop. At night, I tied my hair back and served beer at Katy Trail Ice House. My feet ached, my wrists smelled like lime, and my tips jingled in a chipped mason jar when I got home. The jar mattered. It sounded like independence. Back then, Ethan was in grad school at SMU, studying finance and sleeping 4 hours a night. Or so he said. I believed him. I believed in us. I covered most of the rent, paid for groceries, and chipped in on tuition when his aid ran short. My 2 paychecks added up to less than $45,000 a year, and somehow it still felt like we were building something steady, something fair. On Fridays, I'd press a 20 into his hand and joke, "Lunch for the future rich guy." He'd grin and kiss my forehead like I was his lucky charm. He used to say, "Once I make it, you'll never have to work again." It sounded like a promise, warm and golden. I pictured lazy mornings and art supplies scattered on a sunny table. I didn't hear the lock quietly clicking into place. The day his offer came, he called me from a campus bench with wind in the phone. 180 base, he said, breathless, plus 25 bonus. I sat down on the floor of our apartment because my knees forgot how to hold me. I cried like a fool, hands shaking, heart loud in my ears. When he came home that night, he brought wine and a small box. Inside was a set of paintbrushes wrapped in tissue, real sable hair, handles smooth like river stones. "Now you can finally do what you love," he said. I pressed the brushes to my chest until the hair smelled like my skin. Love felt like possibility then. I quit my marketing job a month later, hands steady when I typed the email, voice steady when I told my boss. I told myself I wasn't quitting work. I was choosing myself. I opened an Etsy shop and called it Claire Draws, prints for $50, custom pieces for $75. I designed quietly in the little room behind our kitchen, a narrow space with low light and a leaky window. I stacked cardstock on the shelf and kept my laptop propped on a shoebox to stop it overheating. The first week, 2 orders rolled in. The second week, 3. I took pictures of the packing slips like they were newborns. Ethan smiled in that soft way men smile when you've done something sweet. "It's cute," he said. "You're happier like this." The words stuck to my ribs. Cute. Not strong, not serious. Cute. I laughed anyway, because I wanted to be easy to love. Money changed in our house without anyone announcing it. He set up online banking to keep things streamlined. He said, "I'll handle our accounts. It's just efficient." I nodded because efficiency sounded adult and practical, and I wanted to be both. One afternoon, he transferred a set amount into a debit card with my name on it. $400 a week, he said, placing it on the table like a gift. "If you need more, just ask. Just ask." The words pricked. I slipped the card into my wallet and bit the inside of my cheek. I told myself this was temporary, a bridge until the shop grew. Temporary can turn into always when you're not looking. When I needed more ink and archival paper, I added up the list twice and stared at the total. $320. I stood in the doorway while he typed into a spreadsheet, his fingers moving fast, the cells filling like a game. "Men feel pressure," she said gently. "Let him lead." I nodded at the empty room, phone pressed to my ear. After we hung up, I stared at the paintbrush box on the counter. The smallest brush had a hair snapped short like a clipped wing. I ran my thumb over it until the pad tingled. Every freedom in that house came with a receipt. Days blurred into a quiet routine. CNBC murmured from the living room most evenings, numbers crawling across the screen like ants. He'd sit with his laptop open, rows and columns bright on his glasses. I moved around the edges of his focus. I cooked, I cleaned, I worked in my narrow room with the window that rattled when the wind shifted. Coffee turned bitter on the warmer. My shoulders ached. I told myself this is what building looks like, messy, patient, invisible. Small victories kept me breathing. One afternoon, 12 orders hit in the same day. 12! I lined the prints in a row across the desk like parade flags and did the math out loud. 720. My voice wobbled on the last syllable. I almost walked into the living room to show him, to say, "Look, I'm not nothing." I stopped in the doorway and swallowed the sentence. The room smelled like old coffee and metal, and he didn't glance up from his spreadsheet. My excitement went quiet inside me, like a bird tucking its head under a wing. Later that week, he found a grocery receipt I'd forgotten to log. "If you can't handle a budget," he said, not raising his voice, "how do you expect to run a business?" "I'm learning," I said. "You're emotional with money." "Let me handle it." My eyes burned. "You're right," I whispered, though everything inside me was screaming that he wasn't. That night, after the house went still, I lay on my side and watched the ceiling. The air felt heavy. My hands wouldn't unclench. He slept, breath even, warmth radiating across the mattress. I turned my mouth toward the dark and let the smallest, sharpest truth escape. "I'm not stupid," I whispered. "I'm just tired of being small." My voice trembled, my chest eased. A line had been said out loud, and once words exist, they don't go back into the box. Morning came with that dry-mouthed taste that follows poor sleep. I read it twice. Then a third time. The letters didn't change. I leaned on the counter because my knees loosened and the room tilted a little. My heart was a drum, too fast, the kind they tell you to breathe through. I wanted to scream, to laugh, to run circles around the table. I wanted to call someone who would say, "Yes, yes, yes, this is real." From the doorway of the living room, I could see Ethan's shoulders squared toward his screen. He wore headphones. Numbers blurred and scrolled on his laptop. He didn't look up. I stood there with an email that felt like a door, and the person who once promised freedom sat 10 feet away measuring the cost of milk. I walked back to my small room, the one that smelled like paper and old coffee. I sat down. My hands shook as I set the mug down and it clinked against the desk. The paintbrush box waited beside my laptop, edges worn, lid frayed where my thumb always found it. I opened a new message and stared at the blinking cursor. My fingers trembled. I pressed them into my thighs until the shake softened. Then I typed slowly, carefully, like each letter might decide the rest of my life. "Yes, I'd love to take the project." "Thank you for trusting me," I read the sentence aloud. My voice sounded steady. I signed my name, added my website, and hit send before I could be afraid again. The whoosh felt like a pulse in my chest. Silence followed, except it wasn't empty. It hummed. It felt like the first breath after holding one for too long. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Heat prickled behind them, and I let it. Tears slid toward my ears and cooled as they went. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel like a box. It felt like a beginning. I picked up the paintbrush box and opened it. The smallest brush was still clipped short, still imperfect. I rolled it between my fingers, the wood smooth against my skin. I thought about the night he gave it to me, about how kindness can hide the shape of a cage. I thought about my whispered sentence in the dark and how it still rang in my ribs. Maybe this is the start, I told myself. The words didn't float away. They landed. They made a small, solid sound. I set the brush down carefully, straightened the stack of cardstock, and I kept stirring my coffee, though it didn't need it. "That's great," I said softly. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Now that's a woman who's driven." It sounded light, harmless, but it landed like a blade. I smiled the kind of smile you wear when you're bleeding inside, but pretending it's fine. I said nothing. He went back to reading the Wall Street Journal like he hadn't just crushed me with one sentence. I'd met Lindsay a few months before at one of his office dinners. She had a diamond the size of a raindrop and a laugh that carried. She talked about Napa, about designer listings, about how she manifested her GLC. Ethan hung on every word. He smiled at her the way he used to smile at me, curious, admiring, a little too warm. That night, when we walked back to the car, he said, "You know, Lindsay's built quite the business." "She's smart about her money." I remember the sound of my seatbelt clicking into place. That sharp click felt louder than his words. I looked out the window and said quietly, "I'm building too." He didn't answer. A week later, Lindsay drove by our building in her new Mercedes GLC. The paint looked like liquid glass. Ethan stood by the window watching, then turned to me and said, half joking, half not, "Maybe someday you'll get one like that." I didn't laugh. My hands were in the sink, washing a mug that suddenly looked very breakable. He started getting busier after that. More networking nights, client dinners, team drinks. It became his new vocabulary. When I asked if he'd be home late again, he said, "It's called ambition, Claire." The way he said my name made me feel stupid for asking. He'd come home smelling like cologne that wasn't his, eyes glassy, smile too relaxed. When I'd ask how the dinner went, he'd just say, "You wouldn't understand. Different league." I tried not to think about what that meant. One morning, while doing laundry, I found a white dress shirt with a faint smear of cherry red lipstick on the collar. Not pink, cherry, not mine. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers gripping the fabric until my knuckles went white. For a second, I thought about confronting him, but I didn't. I scrubbed the stain out. One night, he came home early. I'd been waiting for that moment. I said, smiling, "Guess what? I made $6,000 this month." He looked at me over his whiskey glass, then smirked. "I made that before lunch." The room went quiet. He took another sip like he hadn't just gutted me alive. I felt my face go hot, but I forced my lips into a smile. "Good for you," I whispered. Inside, something cracked, the kind of crack that doesn't heal back the same. He tossed his car keys onto the counter. The Mercedes logo glinted under the kitchen light. I knew it wasn't his car. He'd borrowed it from his boss for a weekend trip, but he looked at it like it already belonged to him. The key hit the granite with a sharp clink. That sound still rings in my head sometimes, small, metallic, humiliating. 2 weeks later, Ethan hosted a company BBQ at our house. Everyone was there, his co-workers, their wives, the ones who smiled too wide for photos. Lindsay showed up in a red sundress, holding a bottle of wine with a gold label. When she saw me, she smiled sweetly. "So, Claire, how's your little art thing going?" Before I could answer, Ethan jumped in. "Still a hobby, but it keeps her busy." People laughed, polite, uneasy laughs, but they laughed. I froze. I could feel every heartbeat behind my ribs, hard and fast. I smiled because that's what you do when you're being humiliated in your own backyard. I excused myself and went inside, pretending to check the oven. The oven was empty. I stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter, breathing through the ache in my chest. That night, after everyone left, I worked until 2 a.m. No music, no TV, just me and the sound of my pen dragging across the tablet. Every sale notification that pinged on my phone felt like proof that I still existed. He doesn't know, I thought. He'll see. A few nights later, he came home late. Again. He dropped his jacket on the couch, kicked off his shoes, and looked around. The living room had paint tubes on the floor, sketches stacked on the coffee table. He sighed loudly. "Maybe if you spent less time doodling, we'd have a cleaner house." I froze. Then I turned slowly toward him. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "Maybe if you came home earlier, it wouldn't feel so empty." The words hung in the air like glass about to break. He stopped mid-step, eyes narrowing. For 2 seconds, he didn't speak. Then he grabbed his jacket and left, door slamming behind him. The echo filled the whole apartment. I stood there, hands trembling, adrenaline hot in my throat. I expected to cry. I didn't. For the first time, I didn't apologize. Later that night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The dark was too quiet. I whispered, "When did I start being afraid of my own voice?" No one answered, but I didn't need them to. I turned onto my side and said it again, louder this time. No more silence. The words felt raw in my mouth, but they were mine. In the following days, Ethan's phone habits changed. He started keeping it face down on the counter, always locked, always buzzing. One night, while I was sketching, I heard the faint vibration again. I glanced over. The screen lit up for a second. The name burned into my brain before it disappeared. Lindsay. I didn't move, didn't touch it, didn't even blink. I just sat there, watching the light fade. He started leaving earlier. At first, I thought it was ambition. Big project season, he said. Late meetings, networking. But the truth is, I started counting the seconds he spent looking at his phone instead of at me. He used to kiss me goodbye before leaving for work. Now it was just a casual, see ya. No eye contact, no warmth. Just the sound of the door closing behind him. I tried not to read into it, but when you've been in love with someone long enough, you can feel when something's wrong. Like a room that still smells of smoke after the fire's gone. Then the little things began. His phone stayed face down. Always. He'd leave the room to take calls. He started turning off notifications. Too many work messages, he said. One night, I asked, "Who was that?" He didn't even look up. Work. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But the truth sat heavy in my chest like lead. A week later, I went to grab his jacket from the car. That's when I saw it. In the glove compartment. A folded piece of paper, Ritz-Carlton letterhead. I opened it. Room 418. 2 entrees. 1 bottle of Merlot. $320. The date? The exact night he said he was at a team dinner. My hands trembled. My throat went dry. The air in the car was thick, suffocating. I stared at that receipt like it might change if I looked long enough. It didn't. I closed my eyes and whispered, "It's business, right?" But my voice cracked on the word business, because deep down, I already knew. That night, I placed the receipt on the dinner table, right in front of him. He looked down, barely flinched. "It was business, Claire." "You wouldn't understand." 2 dinners, 1 room, I said quietly. "Looks productive." He smirked, leaning back. "Watch your tone." My hands were shaking under the table, but I made sure my face didn't show it. I just nodded once. "Okay." That word tasted like iron. I locked myself in the bathroom later, turned on the shower, the hottest it could go. I sat on the tile floor, knees to my chest, steam swallowing me whole, and I cried. Not loud, not messy, just silent, breath. I whispered to myself, if I don't create, I'll break. And then I started drawing, for hours, then days. Every line, every shade, every brushstroke carried a piece of the anger I wasn't allowed to show. I didn't draw for him anymore. I drew to survive him. I began posting again. Short videos, time lapses, tutorials. At first just a few hundred views, then 1,000, then 10,000. People started commenting. "Your art makes me want to create again. I wish I had your courage." So I built something new, an online course for beginner artists, $79 each. 3 months later, I had over 400 students, $30,000 in sales. I couldn't believe it. One message stopped me in my tracks. "You changed my life, Claire." "Thank you," I cried, reading that. But this time it wasn't sadness. It was something stronger. Pride. Ethan still had no idea. One night while I was working, he walked past and said, "You waste so much time online, babe." I smiled without looking up. "Yeah, I guess I do." But inside I was laughing. Keep thinking that, I thought. It makes this easier. A week later, I walked into the Apple store, bought a MacBook Pro, $6,000, a tablet, $2,500. All mine, all paid in full. The first time I swiped my card, my hands were shaking. It wasn't fear. It was freedom. I didn't tell him. Some victories don't need witnesses. One night, I sat alone in my small home office. The only light came from the screen. Ethan texted, "Working late again. Don't wait up." I stared at the message and smiled sadly. "Don't worry," I whispered. "I stopped waiting a long time ago." I went back to work, stylus tapping softly, the rhythm almost like breathing. My art didn't just fill the silence anymore. It was my silence, my peace. Then it happened. A notification blinked at the corner of my screen. Subject: Adobe Creative Cloud Partnership Inquiry. I froze. My heart stuttered. I clicked it open, not because of him, not because of pain, but because for the first time in years I'd done something that was mine. "I did this," I whispered through the tears. Me. Alone. One tear hit the keyboard right between the letters C and J. Claire Jennings. It felt like the universe was giving me my name back. I sat there for a long time. No noise, no rush. Just my heartbeat and the soft hum of my laptop. I looked around the room. Paint stains, open sketchbooks, messy desk, and thought, this is what rebuilding looks like. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't waiting for anyone to tell me I was enough. I was finally living like I was. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet wrap around me. Then I looked out the window. The night outside was still. Dallas lights flickered faintly through the blinds. I whispered into the dark, "You'll never see me the same again." And for the first time in years, I meant it. He cheated with lies. I answered with creation. Have you ever taken your pain and turned it into something powerful? Comment, "I build from pain," if you've ever had to start over. And stay for part 5, the breaking point. It was almost midnight. Rain tapped against the windows, slow at first, then heavier, like a warning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, editing a new digital course, headphones on, trying to focus, trying to breathe. Then I heard the door slam, hard. Ethan stumbled in, shirt wrinkled, tie hanging loose, the smell of whiskey and someone else's perfume clinging to him. He tossed his keys onto the counter and snapped, "Why are all the lights on? You trying to burn through our bills again?" I paused my music, took off my headphones slowly. "I'm working, Ethan." He laughed, that cruel, mocking kind of laugh that slices right through you. Working. Doing what? Doodling for pocket change? His words bounced off the marble counters, louder than the rain outside. I didn't answer. I'd learned silence was safer, but not tonight. He started pacing, waving his hands like a drunk politician. "You live in this house, eat my food, use my Wi-Fi, and still act like you're doing something important." "Our house," I said softly. He blinked as if I'd spoken another language, then threw his head back and laughed. "You? Make more than me? Sure, with your cartoon money." I didn't move, didn't flinch. "You heard me." He stepped closer, voice sharp. "Prove it." I sat back down, opened my laptop. My fingers were shaking, but I typed anyway. PayPal, Stripe. 2 tabs, 2 numbers. $178,000.47. The glow from the screen hit his face, and for the first time, he looked small. The laughter stopped. "That's my money," he shouted. "You used my house, my internet, my life." I looked him straight in the eye. "No, Ethan." His jaw tightened. The arrogance cracked. He didn't know what to say. I stood up. My voice didn't shake anymore. "I worked for this while you were busy lying. Every hour you were gone, I built something real." He just stared, red-faced, lost, cornered. "So this is it?" he said finally, bitter. "You get a taste of money and forget who built this life for you." I took a deep breath. "You built a cage," I said. "I just found the door." I reached down, pulled off my wedding ring, set it gently on the counter next to a half-empty cup of cold coffee. The tiny clink echoed louder than thunder. He slammed his hand on the counter. "You're nothing without me." I smiled, the kind of smile that comes when you finally stop being afraid. "Funny, you said the same thing about my art." I turned and walked to the bedroom. Each step felt lighter, like shaking off years of chains. Behind me, I could still hear him muttering, the clinking of bottles, the slurred words, but they didn't reach me anymore. For the first time, his voice didn't matter. I pulled out my suitcase, didn't think, just moved. Folded jeans, a few shirts, my laptop, my sketchbook, my external hard drive, everything that was mine, everything that mattered. No tears, no hesitation. I wrote one line on a sticky note and left it on the counter. "It's not your house anymore." As I walked past my workspace, my laptop screen was still on. An email notice, but they weren't sad tears. They were the kind that mean you made it out. I stopped at a gas station around 2 a.m. The rain had slowed. I sat in the car for a long minute, watching the water slide down the glass. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Ethan. "Come home." Don't be stupid, home. That word used to mean him. Now it meant anywhere he wasn't. I stared at the message until it blurred, then hit delete, closed my eyes, breathed deep. I'm already home. And just like that, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. The first morning in Austin felt wrong, too quiet, too calm, too mine. No one slammed doors, no voice shouted my name like an accusation, just the sound of rain drying on the window and the faint hum of a coffee pot. I sat on the floor with my mug between both hands, staring at the sunlight breaking through my thin curtains. For a second, it almost felt foreign, the peace. Then I whispered to myself, "This peace costs everything I had." Worth it. My new apartment wasn't much. White walls, a thrifted wooden desk, a second-hand laptop that whirred when it got tired. But it was mine, every inch of it. I taped a handwritten note above my desk. Start where you are. Use what you have. That was my mantra. I didn't have luxury. I didn't have backup. But I had my art, and this time I had no one telling me it was cute. I rebranded everything, bought the domain, designed the logo myself. Claire Draws Studio, clean, bold, and simple. It wasn't just a name, it was an act of defiance. On launch day, I clicked publish with trembling hands. 23 orders came in that first night, only 23, but I sat there crying anyway, because every single one of them had chosen me, not the wife of Ethan Jennings, not the woman playing with colors, just me. They chose me, I whispered, without him. But even freedom has its echoes. At night, the silence could be deafening. Sometimes I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow and soft, and I'd wonder if he even noticed I was gone. Then I'd turn over and whisper in, "Yeah, I learned that the hard way." And for the first time, I meant it. 6 months later, things started to shift. $10,000 a month, then $30,000, then $80,000. I hired 3 part-time helpers, then full-time. My apartment turned into an office, boxes stacked high, walls covered with Post-it goals. The girls started calling me Boss Claire, and I didn't correct them, because I was. One Friday, I drove my old, faded Toyota to a Tesla dealership. The salesman smiled politely. "Will this be financed or paid in full?" I smiled back. "Paid in full." When the key landed in my hand, I swear it didn't feel like a car. It felt like permission. Permission to be free. Soon after, I got invited to a podcast, Women in Digital Art. I almost said no. Talking about myself still felt strange. But something inside whispered, "Say yes." When the host asked, "What was your turning point?" I paused, then smiled, when I stopped waiting for permission. That episode went viral. My inbox flooded with messages, young artists, mothers, survivors. Each one said some version of, "You gave me hope." I sat there in my tiny studio, holding my chest, whispering, I gave myself hope first. One evening, I caught my reflection in the mirror above my desk. The woman staring back wasn't trembling anymore. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes were sharp. I looked at her and said softly, I built this, brick by brick. A week later, while sorting old files, I found it, the wooden paintbrush box Ethan once gave me. The hinges were loose and the brushes were worn, but it stopped me in my tracks. I traced my fingers over the lid and whispered, You gave me this to keep me small. A pause. I used it to grow. Then I closed it gently and slid it into the back of a drawer. The sound it made, that quiet click, felt like closure. Then it happened, the email. Subject line, Target Corporate, licensing inquiry for your designs. I blinked twice before opening it. They wanted to license my entire digital collection. A $1.2 million deal. I stared at the screen, hands shaking, and then I cried. But not the same kind of crying as before. Not broken, not scared, proud, whole. I did it, I whispered. I really did it. No one. That's the version of me I wanted to see every day. The next evening, I walked across the Congress Avenue Bridge. The air smelled like rain and freedom. The city lights shimmered over the water, quiet and steady. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes. Freedom doesn't always roar, I whispered. Sometimes it just breathes, quietly. And that's what I did. I breathed, fully, finally. It started on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was at my office in downtown Dallas, reviewing a licensing draft, when one of my team members walked in, a young woman named Brooke. She looked hesitant, like she was about to deliver bad news. Claire, did you hear? She asked. I looked up from my screen. Hear what? She bit her lip. About Ethan. He got fired. My pen froze midair. For what? She hesitated. Something about insider trading. It's all over LinkedIn. I didn't say a word. I just nodded and went back to my papers, pretending to read, but the words blurred into nothing. Through the window, the sunlight glared too brightly. For a long second, I just sat there, letting the weight of it sink in. He used to say, people like me don't fall, we rise. Turns out he wasn't immune to gravity after all. That night, my phone buzzed with messages. A college friend texted, he lost everything. Frozen accounts, investigation ongoing. You were right to leave. 3 days. That's all it took for the man who once controlled my life to lose control of his own. The headlines called him the overconfident analyst who fell too fast. I couldn't decide if it was tragic or poetic. I didn't celebrate. I didn't drink champagne. I just closed my laptop and whispered, You did this to yourself, Ethan. The next week, my world kept spinning, faster than ever. We'd just landed a massive partnership with a California design agency. $500,000 in new revenue, and growing. I remembered his voice in my head, mocking me years ago. You'll never make real money drawing pictures. And I smiled to myself. Guess what, Ethan? I did. A few days later, I overheard more details. He'd lost his BMW lease. The bank repossessed it right outside his firm. He'd been forced out of his luxury condo in uptown Dallas. His friends stopped taking his calls. Someone from his old office told me he'd been arrogant, dismissive, even after the warnings. Now he was renting a one-bedroom in Garland for $900 a month. Funny how the world shrinks when your ego collapses. Then I saw the post on Facebook. Lindsay, the woman he used to compare me to, had disappeared. Apparently, she drained their joint account and ran off with someone else. He'd been left with nothing. No money, no woman, no empire. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Karma has great timing, I whispered, and took another sip of coffee. No hate, no joy, just peace. A week later, I was speaking at a Women in Business meetup. Someone asked during the Q&A, Do you ever think about him? About your ex? I paused, then smiled. Not really. I think more about the woman I used to be when I loved him, and how far she's come. The room went quiet. Someone teared up. It hit me then. This was bigger than us, bigger than revenge. It was about becoming. Soon after, I closed on a townhouse in Highland Park, $1.8 million, all cash. When the attorney slid the papers across the table, he said with a grin, "You're one of the few clients paying full in cash these days." I just smiled. It's funny what a hobby can do. He laughed, not knowing the story behind the words. But I did. Every signature felt like... 2 weeks later, my assistant handed me a magazine with wide eyes. "Claire, look at this." It was Forbes Women. Right there on the cover, from hobby to empire, Claire Jennings' $8 million design brand. The photo they'd used, me sitting in my studio, sunlight spilling across the wall, smiling like peace itself. The caption read, "She turned pain into power and built an empire." For a second, I just stared, not because of the fame, but because of how far away that steakhouse felt. The laughter, the humiliation, the glass of wine shaking in my hand. That woman was gone. I didn't know it then, but Ethan saw it too. He was sitting in his bare apartment in Garland, scrolling through his cracked iPhone, when he saw my face staring back at him. I can almost imagine the silence in that room, how the air must have felt heavy with irony. He probably whispered my name, Claire, like an apology too late to matter. And maybe, for the first time, he felt what I once did, small, unseen, and powerless. Later that night, my phone buzzed again, unknown number. Then the text came, "Claire, I made mistakes. I need help." I froze for a second, reading it again. Then another one followed. "You always believed in me. Please, just one call." I sat there, phone in my hand, heart oddly calm. I thought about the years I'd begged for his belief, for his respect. And now the roles had reversed. He wanted what he once crushed, and I didn't even want revenge, just silence. The next day, the call came. I hesitated before answering, but something inside me said, "End it your way." His voice was weak, trembling, nothing like the man who used to command a room. "Claire, please," he said. "I don't have anyone else." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered every word he used to slice me with. Every time he called me childish, unrealistic, a financial liability. I took a deep breath. "You said it yourself, Ethan," I said softly. "It's just a hobby." Silence. Long. Heavy. He didn't respond. I didn't need him to. "I told you you'd see," I whispered. Then I hung. It was a Monday morning. Quiet, focused, ordinary. My team was buzzing, prepping slides for a big client pitch. Laughter, coffee cups clinking, the hum of printers. Normal. Then the glass door opened, and everything stopped. I looked up from my laptop, and there he was, Ethan. He looked hollow. His once perfect suit was wrinkled, collar-stained, his tie hanging like a noose he'd given up tightening. His shoes were scuffed, and his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, looked dull. For a second, I didn't breathe. Not from fear, not from love, just shock. He stood there, awkwardly shifting his weight, as whispers filled the room. "Is that her ex-husband? He looks rough." I raised my hand gently. "Can we have a minute?" The room fell silent. My team gathered their things, eyes darting between us, then slipped out one by one until it was just him and me. The door clicked shut, and I swear I could hear the air itself waiting. He looked around the studio, the bright walls, the artwork, the framed cover of Forbes Women. He exhaled, voice low and tired. "You really made it." I folded my arms, keeping my distance. I did. He nodded, eyes darting everywhere but mine. "I saw you in Forbes," he said, voice cracking. "You look happy." I smiled, small, controlled. "I am." He ran a hand through his unkempt hair and stared down at his fingers. "I'm not here to beg," he muttered, "but I need a job." The words landed like a dull thud. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. "A job?" He nodded quickly, eyes wide, desperate. "Anything, even part-time. I just need to start somewhere." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The man who once told me I wasn't worth investing in was now standing in my office, asking for a chance. I swallowed hard. "You're serious?" He gave a broken laugh. "I wish I wasn't." For a second, I felt something. Not anger, not revenge, something quieter, sadder, pity. Not for him, but for the version of me who once believed he was the world. He looked so small now, like the wind could break him. "You've always been the talented one," he said suddenly, eyes shining. He looked up again, voice breaking. "Please, Claire, just a second chance. I'm not that man anymore." I studied him, really studied him. The man who used to mock my dreams, who once laughed in front of a table full of people and said I was his charity project. And now he stood there, empty hands, empty eyes, asking me for mercy. "You're right," I said finally. "You're not that man anymore." He looked almost relieved, until I added softly, "And I'm not that woman anymore." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was powerful. It was the kind of silence that says, "This is the end." He opened his mouth again, trying to reach for something, anything. "Claire, I lifted a hand to stop him. "I already gave you 5 years." He froze. "You taught me something important," I continued, "that silence can be louder than any apology." His lips parted, but nothing came out. His shoulders sagged, as if every word I didn't say crushed him more than the ones I did. I stepped past him and opened the glass door. The light from the hallway poured in, washing over us both. "Good luck, Ethan." It wasn't bitter. It wasn't sarcastic. It was final. He stood there for a few seconds, just breathing, then nodded, barely audible. "Take care, Claire." And he walked out. I listened to the sound of his shoes fade down the hallway until it disappeared completely. That same sound I once followed out of a restaurant years ago, humiliated and quiet. Only this time, I didn't cry. I turned back toward the office. The space felt lighter, like the air itself had been waiting for that goodbye. My team trickled back in, hesitant, trying to read my face. One of them asked softly, "Are you okay, Claire?" I smiled. Better than ever. They went back to work, pretending not to glance at me, but I could feel the quiet pride in the room. I sat down at my desk, fingers brushing across the surface where his hand had rested just minutes ago. No bitterness, no shaking, just peace. My laptop pinged, a new email. Subject, Invitation, New York Women's Business Summit, Keynote Speaker. I stared at it for a second, a slow smile forming on my... 1 year later, New York City. The kind of morning that smells like success. Sharp coffee, polished marble floors, and ambition in the air. I was standing backstage at a women's entrepreneurship summit, waiting to go on. My name glowed in gold on the big screen. Keynote speaker, Claire Jennings, founder and CEO of Claire Draws Studio. A year ago, I was packing boxes in a loft apartment, wondering if I'd ever stop flinching at the sound of his name. Now, I was about to tell a room full of 2,000 women how I rebuilt myself from the ashes of someone else's ego. As they introduced me, I took a deep breath. Walking onto that stage felt surreal, like stepping into a version of myself I'd been fighting to meet for years. The applause started before I even said a word, and for a moment, I just stood there, smiling. Because this time, no one was laughing at me. They were rooting for me. I started speaking. "My husband once called my business a hobby," I said, voice steady. The room went still. He said he was paying for my little art project, that I'd never make real money drawing pictures. A few people in the front row shook their heads. Some gasped softly. I smiled. Well, turns out my little hobby paid off the mortgage, built a team of 12, and just hit $25 million in valuation. The room erupted. Cheers, laughter, a standing ovation that hit me like a wave. But I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to tell the truth. I told them about the control, the humiliation, the nights I cried in the bathroom while pretending everything was fine. How I kept creating even when he told me I was wasting my time. How I stayed quiet when the world told me to shrink. And how, one day, I realized that silence doesn't mean weakness. It can be fuel. My journey wasn't about revenge, I said. It was about rediscovery. about realizing that I didn't need anyone's permission to be powerful. There was a hush in the room. Somewhere in the back, I saw a woman crying, quietly, hand over her mouth. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't stop. No one can put a price on self-worth. You can lose everything, your money, your relationship, your home, and still come out richer if you find yourself again. Applause. Real, raw, thunderous. I had my laptop open, half writing an email to the organizers who wanted me back next year, when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number. Until I did. It was him, Ethan. The message was short. I'm proud of you, Ethan. Just that. I stared at it for a long time. Once upon a time, I would have cried reading those words. I would have felt vindicated, validated, desperate to be seen. But not anymore. I typed back, "Thank you." Then my thumb hovered over send, and instead, I hit delete. Because some stories don't need sequels. Some lessons don't need to be retalked. I set my phone down, took a sip of wine, and looked back at the skyline. I thought about every version of myself I'd been, the one who begged for his approval, the one who walked out in the rain, the one who built an empire in silence. They were all still inside me, but tonight only one spoke, the woman who finally knew peace. It's strange how success doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like quiet, like walking into a room that used to suffocate you and realizing you can breathe. Like standing in front of a mirror and finally recognizing the woman looking back. Like knowing you don't need to prove him wrong anymore, because you already proved yourself right. People always ask me what I'd say to him now if I could go back. And honestly, I'd say thank you. Thank you for underestimating me, for every insult that became fuel, for every door you closed that forced me to build my own. Because you were wrong. It wasn't just a hobby. It was my rebirth. The city below pulsed like a heartbeat. Taxis, streetlights, strangers chasing their own stories. I felt completely, beautifully alone, but not lonely. Free. I picked up my phone again and opened Instagram. A photo from the event was already trending. Me standing on stage, hands mid-gesture, the caption reading, "They called it a hobby. She called it a start." I smiled. That's the quote I'd opened with on stage. But now, reading it again, it felt different, more powerful, more true. Because my passion project didn't just build my career, it built me. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't proving them wrong, it's outgrowing the need to.